It is time to vote. Welcome to What's Next, Living Longer, Better, Smarter. This edition is made possible by AARP, working to empower people to choose how they live as they age. I'm Fred Fishkin, along with Mary Furlong. Hi, Mary.
Hi, Fred. Good to be here today.
It is. We're fast approaching Election Day, and since that is what is top of mind everywhere around the country, we're making it top of mind here too. Joining us to help us sort through what you need to know are some very knowledgeable guests from AARP.
So let's first turn to the Chief Advocacy and Engagement Officer at AARP, Nancy Lemon. Nancy, wonderful to have you here.
Great to be here. Thanks for having us.
Well, you oversee government affairs and legislative campaigns for AARP, Nancy, in addition to managing public education, volunteerism, multicultural outreach engagement with staff members and volunteers in all 50 states. And we're going to be hearing from some of those states, specifically some swing states. First, Nancy, AARP has a long, proud history of nonpartisan work when it comes to voter engagement. Tell us how that's taken shape during this election year.
Well, Fred and Mary, thanks for having us, and I'm thrilled that you're also going to be able to hear from our state directors who are on the line and have up-to-date insights. As you mentioned, AARP is a nonpartisan organization. We don't endorse candidates. We don't donate money, but we do two important things in every election. First is we press the candidates for all offices to address issues that are important to older Americans. And then secondly, once we have the candidates address those issues, we take it upon ourselves to make sure our members and the 50 plus generally know where the candidates stand on those issues so that they can make informed decisions at the ballot box. This year, we have one additional activity that we're very focused on, and that's being able to provide up-to-date information to all of our members on how they can vote safely. And so we have a website that will show people what they need to do in their states in this election year.
You know, I think that's really important, Nancy. I voted yesterday, and I had to think a little bit about where I was going to mail that ballot in and how to stay safe while doing it. Tell us a little bit about the polling that you do, and how do you keep a pulse on the audience?
AARP recently conducted polls in 11 battleground states, including Arizona, Florida, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Georgia, Iowa, Colorado, Maine, and Montana. And you listeners can find details of those polls in aarp.org/2020 poll. But here are a few of the highlights. The first we call Power at the Polls. Voters over 50 will be voting, and earlier than ever. So candidates need to pay attention to them now if they want to win. There are going to be more than 115 million Americans age 50 and up whose views span the ideological spectrum. They have a broad range of backgrounds and life experiences, but one thing they have in common is that they vote. And in the 6 battleground states, more than 94% of voters 50 plus told us that they are absolutely certain they will vote this year. So that's a big chunk of folks going to the polls. The second is what we're calling the senior switch. Seniors who voted for President Trump by a 7-point margin over Hillary Clinton in 2016, and also favored every Republican senator in 2014, are leaning to Joe Biden and Democratic candidates. In every state except for Georgia, voters 65 plus are more likely to vote for Joe Biden for president and the Democratic candidate for Senate than the voters 50 to 64, where the races are generally much closer. Overall, the pattern that emerges from our polling, and it's consistent with many other public polls that you're seeing, is that Republicans are lagging their previous performance with voters 65 plus in a way that should cause them serious concern. The third finding is a gender gap. there's a significant gender gap apparent across among voters 50 plus. In Colorado, Georgia, Iowa, Maine, and Montana, women 50 plus are considered more likely to vote for Joe Biden for president and the Democratic candidate in the Senate than men 50 plus. Now, in terms of issues, it's all about health and economic security. Older Americans are very focused on those two areas. The 65 plus are largely experiencing the pandemic as a health crisis. And not surprisingly, for 50 to 64-year-olds, it's both a health and an economic crisis. And then transcending partisan politics, despite extreme partisanship, protecting Social Security, Medicare, lowering prescription drugs transcends partisan politics. In our polling, the majority of voters 50 plus say that they are more likely to vote for a candidate who will stand up to protect Social Security, strengthen Medicare, lower drug costs, and increase protections for nursing homes.
Yeah, I was struck by that when I looked at the data. It was very interesting how consistent it was in those different categories. And they've been hurt by the pandemic economically. So can you talk a little bit about the role of older women? I know you've been an advocate around this issue.
Yeah, I've been saying for many months that I think older women are going to be the deciders in this election. I commonly refer to the 2018 midterm election as the healthcare election, where older women played a major role in the Democrats taking over the House. And these older women voters prioritized Social Security, Medicare, and healthcare as the most important factors when they voted for their candidates and who they wanted to send to Washington. In our new polling, we asked if older women are worried about not being able to afford healthcare over the next year. And in 6 presidential battleground states where we polled, between half and almost 2/3 of 50 to 64-year-old women said that they were very concerned about it. And the number was even higher among the 65 plus. If you look at virtually every issue, women are more worried than men as they go to the polls. And so I think worried women are going to be a very important constituency on election day.
We're going to be talking to the state directors in just a minute from some of these swing states. But Nancy, I'd like you to expand a little bit on the issue of how people are voting, because this is the first time I can recall us even having to think about how are we going to vote.
Yeah, it really is interesting. We, in the past, have always provided very general information about voting day. And this time, we know that we have to redouble our efforts. Polling we've done recently show us that voters over the age of 50 are either going to vote in person early or on election day, mostly on the early side, or from home through absentee ballots. There are differences among states. Maybe some of our state directors will talk about that. But we know, even in some of the early results, that the older voter has already filled out his or her ballot and has it in the mail, or they've already been to a local polling place.
Well, let's take a look at one of these states. From Michigan, AARP State Director Paula Cunningham is here with us. Hi, Paula.
Hi, it's so nice to be with you all. Thank you for having me.
Well, let's start out with how people over 50 are taking to new ways to vote in Michigan.
Well, they're doing very well. Our numbers really reflect what Nancy talked about nationally as well. Adults particularly are doing well. Our battleground state poll shows that 51% of voters 50 and older intend to vote by mail, and another 8% will vote absentee in person or at their clerk's office. And really among those voters who are 65 years and older, Fred, 67% of them intend to vote by mail.
Is that viewed as a partisan issue?
Oh, absolutely. Nearly 7 in 10 of the Biden supporters plan to vote by mail, compared to 31% of Trump voters. And 84% of Biden voters are confident in the vote by mail option, while only 76% of Trump voters are not confident that vote by mails will be counted accurately. So the conventional wisdom says that higher turnout favors Democrats and voting by mail leads to higher turnout. But however, some Republicans also contend that voting by mail invites fraud And research indicates, however, that neither one of those statements, which you won't be surprised about, neither one of those statements are true. When we did a poll just a little while ago, 23% of people had already voted by mail. So it is going to be a very significant option.
I wonder if there might be long-term change if people see voting by mail as being more convenient. But this year, it's the coronavirus that's the real motive for people voting that way, right?
Absolutely. It is a major, major concern. I know when we did a poll just 2 weeks ago, it's something like 47% of people still were very concerned about how to vote. And voting by mail, although 34% of Biden voters intend to vote by mail, 11% of Trump voters are worried they won't be able to vote because of COVID, particularly. An August statewide poll commissioned by ARP showed that 6 in 10 voters age 50 and older are really worried about becoming infected by the coronavirus. So that is a major, major issue. And COVID has also become a major campaign issue, especially for 65 and older voters who were 50 and older. 59% of those opposed President Trump handled the coronavirus pandemic. That's here in Michigan, including 60% of voters 65 and older. However, Biden leads 18 points among voters 65 and older, and Trump won that particular demographic. Mary and Fred, they won that by 4 points 4 years ago, but things have changed.
So are voters over 65 a cinch for either party?
You know, when you say, are they a cinch? There is nothing that's a cinch in 2020. We all know that by now. Every day seems like something changes. But in 2018, particularly, Michigan voters passed a constitutional amendment allowing no reason voting. And so that has really been no reason voting at all. You can get an absentee ballot for any reason, same day voter registration for whatever reason that you want to get an absentee ballot. So clearly there is no slam dunk for Republican or Democratic candidates. Trump won more than 50% of voters at 65 in 2016. And polling today indicates that he's 18 points behind Biden. So there are no slam dunks in Michigan.
Well, Arizona is another state being closely watched, and the AARP state director there is Dana Kennedy. Hi, Dana.
Hi, Fred. How are you?
Terrific. So what's going on there? Arizona had been known as a red state. You got a nice red dress on, I think, or a blouse. Has that been changing?
It has been. A lot of people are moving to Arizona from other states. And we also have a rising increased population with the Hispanic Latino community. So those factors alone it's just changing the demographics of Arizona tremendously. And so in our last major election, 2018, we actually elected a United States Senator, Kyrsten Sinema, to the Senate, a Democrat. And we also had our Secretary of State, Katie Hobbs, also a Democrat, won election. And our Superintendent of Public Education, Kathy Hoffman, also won statewide election. So we're really seeing a trend here of Arizona turning to be a purple state. We'll see after this election what color we are, but we're definitely no longer a red state.
And an interesting Senate race going on there too, right?
Very interesting. So Martha McSally, who lost 2 years ago to Senator Sinema, she was then appointed to fill McCain's seat. So interesting enough, what people don't realize is this is a special election. So whoever wins the Senate seat this year, 2020, gets to run again in 2022.
Oh boy, wow. What impact do you think COVID-19 might be having on the way people vote? And can you talk a little bit about your snowbirds and people that come to Arizona? So do they set up residency in Arizona? Is that happening?
They can set up residency in Arizona, and that does happen. I think we still have snowbirds, but I think the trend is more people are making Arizona a permanent home. And so, but interesting, we've actually have a permanent early voting list, and we call it a PEVL. And so we actually vote by mail in huge numbers and have done that for over 30 years. So it's not as much of a partisan issue here in Arizona to vote by mail. And, you know, it's traditionally people who go to the polls are usually your seniors who just love to go to the polls on election day, and everybody else, mails in their ballot early or goes to an early voting location. But here, I think what's going to be different is a lot of people who traditionally go to the polls, they're either going to vote early or they're going to go ahead and turn in their ballot. And then some people hold on to their ballot until the very last minute and they drop it off at the poll. And that delays counting those votes. So we are used to not knowing who wins the election on election day. When Nancy had me do predictions 2 years ago, I said, I predicted spot on, but I said, we're not going to know on election night. And sure enough, I said it'd probably take about a week. And it took about a week for us to find out who was going to represent us in the United States Senate, as well as other statewide offices.
What do you think are the biggest hot button issues in Arizona?
Definitely COVID. We did focus groups, and that is definitely an issue. Healthcare is also a big issue, and Medicare, Social Security. And if you want to know what the hot button issues are, you just have to turn on your television and be bombarded with television ads. And they're all fighting about who's going to cut their Social Security, their Medicare, who's going to actually lower prescription drug costs. Pre-existing conditions is a big issue in the elections as well.
I wondered if you were seeing a lot of older adults want to help out in the polling places and volunteer.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So my neighbor, she's 72, and she called me up and said, Dana, you won't believe it. I just got a job and I'm going to work at the polls. And so I mean, there's also going to be recruiting a lot of younger people as well. But I think some seniors will still work the polls if they're comfortable doing so. But I do know that there's a big push to make sure that we also have enough poll workers.
I just turned 72 last week, so I do think it's a new youthful 72, right?
Absolutely.
Okay.
It sounds as if, Dana, that it's going to have a different feel, this presidential election in Arizona, from presidential elections in the past, that this really is a battleground state. Can you sense this different feeling?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Chuck Todd came out here 2 years ago and he talked about how Arizona is not used to being a battleground state. And, really you turn on the television and you listen to the radio and you're a battleground state just because the amount of ads. My family lives in California. I spent a few days with them, and they were not getting the ads that we get here in Arizona, and they're just becoming more and more and more mudslinging. So you can tell you're a battleground state by just turning on your television.
And we're going to turn to one more key state that typically gets a lot of attention early in the election cycle. That's Iowa. Brad Anderson is the AARP director of the Hawkeye State. Thanks for being here, Brad.
Thank you, Fred. It's good to be here.
Well, how has early voting in Iowa this year gone compared to previous elections?
Well, let me just comment first of all on the ads, because Dana is 100% right. Welcome to being a battleground state, Dana, because in Iowa, we now have a U.S. Senate race that has $165 million being spent on that race. And so we have 4 contested congressional districts, and we have a Senate race, and we have, of course, a purple battleground presidential race. So you've got these ads. It is nothing but candidate ads and prescription drug ads. And so it is absolutely enough to make anyone crazy. So Dana, I apologize. You have to deal with it, but welcome to the game. So as far as the early voting, it's been really interesting, Fred, because we track that closely. In fact, about 20 minutes before logging into your show, I checked the latest numbers, and we have about 700,000 Iowans who have requested absentee ballots. And so that number, for anyone that has followed Iowa politics, is absolutely bonkers, because you compare that to 2016, 22 days out before an election, and that number was 350,000. So literally double the number of people have requested absentee ballots. But in addition to that, early voting started last week in Iowa. And so we've had about a week of early voting. And for me as a campaign guy, and I've worked on campaigns for decades, what you really track is the rate of return at which those ballots are being sent in. And in the last I checked, we have about 100,000 ballots that have already been returned. You compare that to about a week into early vote in 2016, and that number was about 30,000. So you're seeing triple the number of ballots that are returned. So I think, you know, and we've all been talking about this, there's a ton of energy in this race. I think that explains part of it. I also think there are concerns about the process of voting, and Paula alluded to this. We did a poll back in September, and in our poll, we asked a couple pretty simple questions. We said, are you concerned about the reductions in the post office, for example? And I was really struck by the number that we got back, because 88% of Democrats were concerned about reductions in post office versus only 38% of Democrats. But then we asked, are you concerned about voter fraud? Well, 77% of Republicans are concerned about voter fraud, only 22% of Democrats. So you've got these giant things that are weighing on people's mind. You've got the concern about the post office, you've got concerns about voter fraud, and I think that is prompting people to participate a little more quickly. And I can promise you, because we've got very transparent data here in Iowa, campaign managers are absolutely going crazy looking at these numbers every day, because at 4 o'clock, the Secretary of State releases new numbers, and then you have a whole nother list of reasons to be concerned.
What about concerns about COVID?
There are a lot of concerns about COVID, and in our polling, it showed, I think that is why people are certainly requesting to vote early. It was true in the primary, where we had 78% of Iowans actually voted early in the primary, and it was directly tied to the pandemic. So I think COVID explains a lot of the early voting as well. I certainly think COVID explains the shift in the 65 plus population vote, like Nancy alluded to and others have alluded to. Frankly, I have never seen anything like this. I have followed polling for decades. I have never seen a gap like this exist between 50 to 64-year-olds and 65 plus. In Iowa, that gap is about 38%. So you've got a plus 22 margin for Trump among 50 to 64, but you've got a plus, I think, 17 margin, if my math is right, for Biden. And in that 65 plus demographic went 4 points for Trump in Iowa in 2016. So I've said this before, this election is going to come down to how 65 plus voters decide to vote, because either they're going to return home to President Trump or they're going to vote for change. Either way, they're deciding the outcome of this election.
Why is it, do you think, that there is this difference between those aged 50 to 64 and those over 65?
Well, I think there are a couple of reasons. Our pollster at AARP is a Republican pollster by the name of Bob Ward, and he says it's COVID, right? Because 65 plus voters are directly impacted by COVID. It is a life or death issue for them, versus 50 to 64 are more concerned about the economy. Therefore, they're more inclined to support President Trump. But there was also on Twitter last week a pollster by the name of John Anzalone, who is a Democratic pollster, and he had this other really interesting theory for the 65 plus shift, which is 65 plus voters really do value bipartisanship. And you see this in not only polling, but in focus groups. They really talk nostalgically about wanting to get back to an era where it is much more bipartisan. And so when you've got Vice President Biden talking about working with Republicans, and you've got Republicans on TV endorsing Vice President Biden, I think that is really helping his 65 plus vote.
We had a guest on a prior show talk about the contextual relationship between, like, the pork plants and senior housing, and how in a community you have a lot of closeness with people. What are you doing to ease voter concerns about going to the polls on Election Day?
Well, my answer is everything. and I mean everything. We are doing mail. We are doing telephone town halls with our Secretary of State. In addition to that, we have the Bulletin magazine, which goes to every AARP member. In Iowa, we have 360,000 AARP members. For the first time, we have a full page spread that tells voters how to vote, either if they want to, and it's got all the deadlines listed too. So if you want to vote early, it's got a list of how you do that. If you want to vote in person, it's got steps you need to take as far as voter ID is concerned to vote in person. So we are doing everything. And I have told Nancy, I really do believe this is going to be record turnout for the 50+ population. And I would like to think that we're playing a big role in that.
And if you want to, can you tick off again for us the biggest issues there that the voters are considering?
Well, the biggest issues, so you've got this battle between the economy and COVID, and you've got the economy for 50 to 64, you've got COVID for 65+. I had a pollster back in 2002 that I worked with that I was gathering research nuggets for the pollster, and my job was to, as a young staffer, was to get him stuff to poll. And he kept talking about pocketbook issues, and I kept giving him, gun votes and other stuff. And he kept talking about pocketbook issues. And so finally he's like, look, kid, all campaigns and all elections are about pocketbook issues. And so far, every general election, he's really been right about that, but there's never been an election where there's also been a global pandemic. And so this may be the exception to that rule. And if it is, rest assured, I'm going to give him a call.
I had one other question. What about small business in Iowa? Do you see a lot of worry there?
Incredible concern. And that's why I do think, the playing politics with this latest round of stimulus is really dangerous, because there are people whose businesses depend on that stimulus. And I'll say too, yesterday I was walking around the East Village of Des Moines, Iowa, which is where our AARP office, we have not been allowed to go back to that office now for months. It was the first time back in 6 months. I cannot tell you how many businesses were closed. I was just, it blew my mind. And so, to see it firsthand like that, you have to understand that there are business owners that are counting on that. So I don't know who's going to get blamed per se for the antics going on in Washington right now related to the stimulus, but it's a dangerous game they're playing.
Yeah, I agree. We see the same here in San Francisco. So Nancy, turning back to you, remind our listeners and viewers where they can get more information about polling and voter engagement resources at AARP.
Yes, please, everybody come to aarp.org/election 2020. We have a lot of information there, including how to vote, where to vote, and also information on the issues that are important to older Americans.
What impressive state directors you have. This was very
We really do want to thank you, Nancy, and Paula, Dana, Brad. Thank you so much for spending time with us.
Now go vote, everybody.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
I actually voted yesterday. I have to turn it in today.
Yeah. Me too. Me too.
Well, that was really a great conversation with the folks from the AARP, Mary. Lots of great information. And as we're saying, we really want to encourage people to get out to vote. And you and I have lots of memories about political campaigns of years gone by. I mean, we've seen a few. What sticks out most in your mind?
Well, one of my hopes for this election season is that school children and high school students would get involved in the issues. So I think the first time I became aware of politics was in 7th grade. And I remember it was the election with people were walking around with "I like Ike" buttons, And so I think I'm a little older than you, Fred, so that's what I remember the first one, but it was exciting to know who won, to find out how the election would turn out. How about you?
Well, lots of things. I mean, so many nights staying up late to watch election returns, even as a kid, how exciting that was. And the political conventions were so different back in those days, too, because it wasn't always a foregone conclusion as to who was going to get the nomination. And I remember my parents being divided over Kennedy and Nixon back in 1960. My father was for Kennedy. My mother, for one reason or another, didn't like Jackie. People have all kinds of reasons. So
Yeah.
there was a divided household. And then the turbulent year of 1968, I was in high school, moderated actually a mock debate that fall in a social studies class. And some of my fellow students were playing the parts of Democrat Hubert Humphrey, Republican Richard Nixon, and that year, George Wallace as well. It was the year when we had lost Martin Luther King and then Bobby Kennedy, and there was upheaval in many cities. And I guess that's what helped Nixon win, was his law and order campaign with all that had gone on in the cities, and a promise that he had a secret plan to end the Vietnam War.
Well, like many women early in my career, I started out in teaching and I taught government and I took students to Washington, and I tried to inspire in them a love for getting involved. And, you know, one of my students went on to work in the White House Office of Hispanic Affairs. And then later in my career, as I became an advocate for older adults, especially older adults empowerment through technology, I was invited to become a commissioner during the Clinton administration. And that was incredibly exciting to be able to look at policy around the digital divide, policy that would provide older adults information access, and how important that is today in time of COVID, right? And so I got to see up close how policy is formed. And that was pretty exciting. I got to go to the inaugural ball, and of course there are 13 of those, right? But I've always felt it's important to have a stake in the issues in a campaign, whatever you care the most about. So I like that our voices are being heard, and I'm not at all surprised that 72-year-olds are stepping up to to be part of the pollsters.
You know, speaking out, letting your opinion be known, something that I guess this year has been kind of difficult for a lot of people because emotions can run high, and divided neighborhoods, even divided families very often make it difficult sometimes for people to speak out, but it is important. I know as a journalist, it was difficult for me working in radio in New York to express an opinion because that wasn't my job. I've always felt it was important as a reporter in New York that my opinions were my own and they could not influence the listeners. That wasn't my job. I wasn't an opinion person. I wasn't doing the editorial content. So it was interesting. And I got to go to the White House too during the Clinton administration. That was the year when they brought in a fellow named Jock Gill, who was involved in bringing the internet to life and creating a website.
Right. That's how I got my White House appointment. I mean, Jock Gill was, I was a beta tester of whitehouse.org because I was looking at the technology solutions that would help older adults stay connected. It is a time where these issues are so important. I don't know of a time where it's been more important to speak out about the things that you care the most about. And I see a lot of engagement. We see no advertising in California. It's interesting. When they were talking about these battleground states, you see very little political advertising here, but you do see a lot of participation by people who are quietly writing letters and quietly contributing to campaigns. And I think, you know, the vice presidential debate got record numbers of people watching it, you know.
And I'm sure the final presidential debate, which will be next week, I suppose, will get big numbers too. And it's interesting that no debate this week. Instead, we get, it looks like probably 2 town halls, maybe running at the same time, which means that we're all losers when that happens. I suppose it's like watching the news. Some people watch one news channel and others watch one or two others, and so we're divided as a population, and that's what may happen with a town hall this week, perhaps. Anyway.
Well, you know, the boomers are the most well-educated generation of their time because they were the first generation that went to college in such record numbers, and so now they're 75 at the top end and 55 at the low end, and they have a lot of interest in what happens next. And I think a lot of these programs, I was not at all surprised at the poll data from AARP on how consistent these issues are around Social Security and Medicare and preserving those programs. And I think pre-existing conditions. But one of the issues that came up in our discussion around small business, a lot of boomer families own small businesses and they employ other family members. And right now with COVID, that's been an up and down time. And so I think really looking at the financial issues and the political issues are important.
And again, who gets the blame for them being closed? It can go back and forth in the same kinds of arguments that we hear about other issues. I mean, it's who gets blamed for businesses being closed because of COVID.
And I also know, Fred, you do work with transportation. So one of the hottest issues here in California is gig workers, many of whom are older, who like the flexibility. And, will that, I predict that proposition will get a lot of votes just on that alone. And so I think there's a lot of local issues that people are concerned about as well.
And it's interesting too, Mary, you and I had been talking that the amount of advertising there is, political advertising, that has nothing to do with your particular state, that a Senate race in another state is being advertised nationally and or in California or in the New York market area where to try to get donations.
And we are approaching this in this presentation, but we may take a look at some of the Silicon Valley companies and the role they're playing in the election, maybe tuck that into another conversation that we have, because certainly there's a lot of debate about that as well. But mostly we want to inspire our listeners to go out and vote and to participate.
We do. And one last reminder, I suppose, that for voting information in your state, you can go to aarp.org, O-R-G, or the League of Women Voters has vote411.org. For fact checking, maybe head to the Pulitzer Prize winning politifact.org. And you can find us at maryfurlong.com/podcast. Mary, it's been a great discussion once again, great guests, and always great to see you.
Yeah, thank you. Stay safe and go out and vote, Fred. Okay.
So, thank you for listening or watching. Don't forget to vote and stay safe.